Brilliant. So, hi everyone. This is Dr. Pollinanium, and we are here with the Work and Learning Research Center. That's also a part of the SERS at Middlesex University. And we're also a network of the University's Association for Lifelong Learning. And we have with us today, we're very lucky to have Jonathan Garnett, Professor Jonathan Garnett, speaking about some recent research. So I'm going to pass over to Jonathan. Jonathan, would you like me to share the screen now, or do you want to introduce first?
Share the screen now, Paula, thanks. Yeah, if you just want to go on slideshow and first slide.
Okay, there we go.
Okay, so really good to see many old colleagues actually, and new people as well. And thank you to Paula for this opportunity to talk about by far my favorite subject, which is work-based learning. And in particular, it's an opportunity to update colleagues about a recent piece of research. So, Paul, if we could have the next slide, please. So an overview, basically, I'm going to say just a little bit about my previous relevant experience, but don't worry, I'm not going to dwell on that for too long. The main item that I really want to put out and share with colleagues is thoughts about arising from research that's been taking place with Leeds Trinity University. Some maybe more general reflections on learning through impact of work that have been stimulated by that. And then I hope, a significant time for questions and general discussion. So if that wasn't what you were expecting, feel free to leave now. Next slide, please. So in terms of relevant experience, I think the main point is just to say that I've been engaged in the work-based learning space for quite a long time now. And the point about the origins of work-based learning at Middlesex is just to say that back in the early 1990s, we took quite a unique starting point when looking at the relationship between learning and work, because our starting point was actually the individual already in work rather than a student perhaps going out on placement. And that's sort of really been quite critical in my engagement with work-based learning and how I've sort of understood it and interpreted it. I had a very significant period where I had a strategic sort of management role at Middlesex in work-based learning area. And then since leaving that in 2014, I've been having great fun working with a whole variety of different institutions, UK universities, mainly in relation to the degree apprenticeship agenda, doing sort of things like curriculum development, staff development, but then also internationally. I'm currently working with an organization called the Global Centre for Work Applied Learning based in Australia, for instance, and got ongoing work with the New Zealand Quality Assurance Agency. So great fun, but again, the common theme is work-based learning. Currently, I'm a visiting professor at Leeds Trinity University, and that's the context under which I was engaged with them doing the research around their degree apprenticeship provision. I'm also a long-standing member of the board of the University's Vocational Awards Council. So UVAC really is the premier champion in the higher education sector in the UK for all things related to work-based learning, and particularly at the moment, very much in the degree apprenticeship space. So if you're not familiar with UVAC, they run a really great annual conference and a lot of really useful online seminars and things that you can engage with them. And then significantly, the UVAC journal, Higher Education Skills and Work-Based Learning. Next slide, please. So just a brief background on degree apprenticeships. So the apprentices have already to be in employment. So they're doing that balance between paid work, but also demonstrating that they've met predefined occupational standards. They're not paying themselves for that. the degree apprenticeships are funded by a levy taken based on the payroll of major employers. And there's around about 100 universities in the UK currently engaged in that sort of higher degree apprenticeship space. So it is a major growth area, and one of the few areas where there's still new pots of development funding coming on stream. So from a higher education perspective, it is very important to us. Next slide, please. So to move into the phase describing the research at Leeds Trinity University, I was fortunate to be able to carry this out with Paula Rainier, the head of apprenticeships at Leeds Trinity. And it was actually a really good combination to have somebody who was fully steeped in the Leeds Trinity context, and myself largely as an outsider, so no direct involvement with the apprentices, no direct involvement with the employers. The aim of the research, it was about really getting first-hand accounts to shed light on the perceived benefits and limitations of degree apprenticeships, critically both as perceived by individual apprentices, but also by their employers. So trying to bring together those two voices. And interestingly, although the whole apprenticeship agenda is supposed to be employer-led, I think in terms of what's being reported from the research perspective, we focus very much just on the apprentices, or maybe on the experience of higher education delivering apprenticeships, and there's been less, I think, from the employer's perspective. That's my personal feeling anyway. Next slide, please. So I undertook 10 in-depth interviews, 5 apprentices and 5 employers. So we were matching up. So there was an apprentice voice and an employer voice from the same organisation. We were looking for a spread of different types of employers. So we had 2 public sector, 3 private, and one of those private was a small, well, actually medium-sized enterprise, around about 200 employers. And we covered 3 different degree apprenticeships. So that was the senior leader, business-to-business sales, and the chartered manager apprenticeship. So again, we were going for a range of different apprenticeships. We're also trying to have a range of different ages in terms of the apprentice participants. So 2 of the 5 were under 25. The other were more mature at different stages in their career. So we're trying to be as sort of inclusive as possible. We were also deliberately selecting or approaching people to invite them to participate, people who are already well into doing their degree apprenticeship. So they were at least a year into the apprenticeship, and in some cases in the final stage. The approach that we were taking was very much a grounded theory one, both in terms of collecting the data and then in the analysis of the data. So what we were trying to do was to come pretty much with an open mind. So it was critical that I was the person that was undertaking the initial interview. So I didn't know anything really about the particular context. Next slide, please. And my role as interviewer was very much just trying to get these people to open up, to talk about their experience of the degree apprenticeship. But doing that within 3 very broad categories. So the initial question was, why did you become involved in the degree apprenticeship? So from the apprentice's point of view, why did you want to take it? From the employer's point of view, what was the motivation? So what happened on the degree apprenticeship journey? What was your experience? And what would you say were the outcomes of doing that, both from the individual apprentice's point of view, but also any wider outcomes, maybe the immediate team context that the apprentice was in, or maybe perhaps wider organizational outcomes. But the focus is very much on open-ended, getting them to talk, maybe interjecting things like, could you say a little bit more about that, but in no way leading the conversation. Next slide, please. So in terms of what we found, and we did an initial process of working independently, that's Paula and myself, in terms of looking at the transcribed interviews, trying to identify themes, and then working through a process where we would then bring together the themes that we'd identified, and between us agree what we saw as being the overarching themes. So looking at that first motivation question, so one of the themes that came through was one that we decided to describe as labour market competitiveness. And from the individual apprentice's point of view, there's some quotes here. So each apprentice is given a number, so you can sort of see it's different people and saying these things. And it's interesting that the first one I know was from somebody who was at the point where they might have made a choice to go and do a conventional degree program, but they clearly thought through, and what really attracted them to the degree apprenticeship wasn't the fact that they weren't going to have to pay so much as the fact that they felt that was going to really sort of boost them by giving them real work experience and the ability to relate that degree level learning to work, and seeing that as giving them actually, and you know, the direct quote was they'd have an advantage over other people within the industry. So interesting. The next one, somebody more established in work, saying, I needed progression, and that I'd run up against a barrier, and this was going to enable me to get beyond that barrier. And then the third quote, this was someone who already had a higher education qualification in a specific work-related subject, but what they felt they didn't have and was now beginning to hold them back were the softer management skills. So technically they were well qualified, but they wanted to be able to assume more perhaps project management, project leadership type roles. So for them, it was very much a reskilling opportunity. But all those things fitting into that broad category of labour market competitiveness. Next slide, please. The next thing that apprentices were telling us in terms of the initial attractiveness of why do a degree apprentice was this notion that it would fit with both their personal and their professional lives. So this is one of the more mature apprentices saying that she needed a higher education qualification, but how was she going to fit this in with her busy life? You know, I got family, house, that kind of stuff. How is it possible to take a degree at the same time? And the degree apprenticeship seemed to offer that opportunity. And that's echoed, I think, then the next quote there. It's not possible to step away from the work, so I need to be able to combine the two. And then I think also, interestingly, the knowledge needed to make sense for them. You know, why am I gaining this learning? It's because I can see that I can apply it into practice. So then that's another major sort of motivating dimension of this overarching theme of fit. Next slide, please. And then finally, from the motivation point of view, apprentice being very upfront, you know, great. From a financial perspective, I can study and I don't have to pay. So again, the younger people are saying, yeah, I can do the degree, and rather than coming out with very significant debt because of having to take the student loan, I'm in full-time employment, I'm getting a wage, and the cost of the degree is being paid for. And interestingly, from the employer perspective, this and this was clearly an employer that was big enough to have had to pay the levy. saying we paid the money in, so clearly we're looking for whatever opportunities we can to gain benefit from that for our own staff, for our own workplace. Another employer motivation that started to come through as well, which I haven't captured with one specific quote, but it was working with these younger people at the outset was very much one about being able to mold your own people. Next slide, please. So in terms of now then of addressing the sort of the broad question about, so what was your experience in the degree apprenticeship? And a major theme there, as you might expect, given the initial motivations, was how did it work out this proposition that I was going to be able to balance work and study? And that was seen as still being the biggest challenge, but one which was possible. So that's, I'm trying to sort of capture that in the A5 apprentice quote. But just to show that, you know, things are not always necessarily rosy. We had an employer saying, you know, my initial thought was, this seems a huge task. And they actually admitted that they were really skeptical because they really didn't believe it was going to be possible for someone to balance a busy work role with the study required to gain a degree. So, and you know, from a line manager perspective, there's quite a lot of caution and trepidation there. Is this going to divert the person? Are they going to be actually less productive in the workplace as a consequence of doing this degree? Next slide, please. So in order to balance that tension between work and study, the key issue that came out time and time again was the notion of the ability to align the degree apprenticeship with the real work. So the concept of alignment was key for us when we were looking for the significant themes. So where there was good alignment, the apprentices were saying things like, you know, I can see the synergies. And where that worked well, it worked really well. And the notion of gaining theoretical knowledge from the university, different models, but then being able to put them into practice. So again, this is almost sort of like textbook, ideally how you'd want the degree apprenticeship to work. And again, the voice of caution coming in from the employer saying, yeah, that worked really well. But you know, it's just as well that it did, because I can't imagine how they would have been able to fit everything in if there hadn't been that alignment. So the notion of alignment is really critical. Next slide, please. So looking at the role of employers in this, in terms of being able to support the apprentices, what was interesting was that was critical in terms of helping to bring about this alignment between the, if you like, the academic part, the degree university input, and the ability to apply that in the work context. So your employer was had a key role in that, in terms of identifying opportunities within the work, maybe in terms of opening doors for the apprentice, maybe in terms of helping them to scaffold, to schedule what they were being required to do. And that was very much appreciated by the apprentices. So they were saying things like, the fact that I was on a degree apprenticeship gave me the opportunity to broaden my experience within the work context. So with the assistance of my maybe line manager or other champion within the organization, I was able to get a broader experience than I would otherwise have done. I was perhaps being asked to engage in projects that were taking me outside of my original work role, perhaps requiring me to work across different departments within the work organization. And sometimes where the apprentice was making a case for doing things differently, the employer also had a critical role in terms of championing why colleagues but who weren't engaged in the apprenticeship were maybe being asked to modify the way in which they were working. So one apprentice talked very much about resistance to a change in process that he was championing, introducing as part of his apprenticeship. And the initial reaction from colleagues was, we've been doing this way for years. It's not broken. It doesn't need fixing, or it doesn't need improving. And there, the senior manager supporting the apprenticeship had a critical role in terms of saying, actually, it really does need fixing. So helping to make the case, to make it easier for work colleagues to understand what was going on. So that intermediary and championing role of the employer was seen as being really very significant. Next slide, please. University support, obviously from both the apprentices and the employer's point of view, was seen as being, that was a critical thing. Was it going to be flexible enough, responsive enough to the needs both of the individual learner, but also taking into account their work context? And the apprentices were not backwards in terms of feeding back when they felt that things were not going as they needed to go. So an apprentice there saying changes had been made as a result of what we've said. I think generally both the apprentices and the employers are very appreciative that this was basically, it was a new initiative. So they were, taking on board that to an extent the university was also learning as it went along. Very, very interesting that the key attribute of, what made a good tutor was their ability to relate their subject expert knowledge to the workplace. And that held both from the apprentice perspective and from the employer's perspective. And tutors who were able to do that were described with words like, they were amazing, they were so supportive, it was really helpful. Whereas the comparatively small number, it appeared, who really struggled to be able to help that translation of theoretical general knowledge into practical application was seen, and quite amusingly from my point of view, described as too academic. Got to climb down out of your ivory tower. This is great, but how can we use that in the real life work situation? So the ability of the university tutor to act as almost like a translator from theory into practice was seen as being a critical and highly desirable skill. Next slide, please. So then moving on to the general question about, so what were the outcomes? And clearly a very significant outcome from the individual's point of view, but also from the employers was the actual achievement of a higher education qualification. So it makes a difference that they've not just completed the apprenticeship, but that they're getting a UK honours degree as a part of that journey. And interestingly, the one employer was talking in such glowing terms about it, and fantastic qualification was a direct quote there. Also, both apprentices and employers were very aware that the increased knowledge, skills, and confidence of the apprentice that had been brought about, and they were, they're very happy to attribute it directly to the degree apprenticeship journey. And that was then sort of played out in terms of employers talking about their apprentices now being capable of thinking on a different level. It's an interesting one. And also thinking more creatively. So in other words, the sort of, if you like, critical thinking that we would see as being very much the hallmark of higher education was something that was clearly being developed. It was being recognized and being valued. and particularly being valued because it was being applied to the work situation. And apprentices were also talking about how they felt that their input was now being more valued, and it was also clearly opening doors for them to operate at a more strategic level. So that was very interesting. Next slide, please. From the point of view of direct benefits to work, the employers were very clear that as well as, if you like, the benefits from having a more capable and confident employee, there were very considerable benefits coming out of individual work-based learning projects. And some of these projects, you know, they weren't necessarily big ones in our academic terms. So we're talking maybe 15, 20 credit point projects, as well as, you know, 30, 40. So not necessarily massive projects. Also projects done at different academic levels. So we're not just talking about projects at level 6. So some of these projects were level 5 and indeed level 4. But they were tackling real life work-based issues around team restructuring, for instance, process engineering, designing and implementing product familiarization courses. So all these things which were things that were going to happen anyway, which is I think this is a critical thing, so that these weren't artificial projects made up solely for the purpose of the degree apprentice being able to satisfy particular apprenticeship standards or to satisfy the assessment requirements for a particular module. It was this notion of alignment between the degree apprenticeship and the world of work. So these were real life issues of real value to the organization being addressed by someone who had this enhanced now theoretical understanding, able to think on a different level as we, but that being focused on a real life issue, and that be continuing to have higher education, university level support. And such were the significance and benefit of these projects that one managing director was actually seeing them as a strategic tool. And this was in the SME. So he was taking a personal interest in every single work-based project that the degree apprentices in his organization were doing. And he'd say, well, when we first started, we were perhaps a little bit loggerheads with the university about what one could reasonably expect within a relatively small work-based project. And so one way of addressing that was looking at, if you like, the big real life work project, and dividing that up into different projects, perhaps being taken by different people as part of their degree apprenticeship, but with that employer having the overall sort of steering and also championing role. And he was very clear that that was making a very significant contribution to the growth of the company and putting sort of bottom line figures on it, but also by improving processes, the company was gaining a reputation for being the go-to if you wanted that particular process. So from their point of view, really, really massive advantages. And I think from my point of view, I wasn't surprised so much by the idea that the work-based projects were of value, but what did hit home very strongly was we weren't just talking about the big projects at the very end of the degree apprenticeship. This was an ongoing benefit. And I think that's sort of really critical increasingly as the work and political agenda is focusing on the notion of productivity. Part of the argument that we as higher education should be deploying in terms of what's the value in working with a higher education provider, it is a direct impact, or at least the potential for direct impact on productivity, not just at the end of some degree apprenticeship, but actually during the course. In fact, in some instances, at quite an early stage of that engagement between the apprentice, the employer, and the higher education provider. Next slide, please. So in terms of sort of reflecting on this and putting it in a sort of broader context of my previous experience, I think it has reinforced this idea that not only does work have learning requirements, but it is genuinely a source of learning, new learning that can be applied. So it genuinely is that you know, the old definition of work-based learning being learning that's for the purposes of work, through work, and primarily at work. So that, you know, that is an important element. It's not the totality, but it's still a very important element of delivering degree apprenticeships. I think it's also resurfaced this notion that, you know, not to valorize the idea of learning at work as being uniformly positive or being perceived as being uniformly positive, because you know, there was definite evidence of resistance from colleagues. That there was also actually evidence, which I hadn't previously spoken about, that how working alongside a degree apprenticeship was in some instances inspiring older, more mature colleagues to think, well, if he or she can do it, why can't I think about a degree apprenticeship? So it is reinforcing the, you know, very much the idea that the degree apprenticeship, yes, it works really well for the, you know, the young 18, 19-year-old, but also think about it as a reskilling, as it being a major way to provide continuing professional development as well. So it's not just about making a choice at 18, it's about widening the choices available for people at different stages in their professional careers. I think it's sort of very much reinforced to me the notion that, you know, learning for the purpose of work has to have a performative edge. And we need to take that as higher education providers very seriously, because we are being primarily judged in the context of degree apprenticeships by, can we facilitate the application of theoretical knowledge, theoretical learning into action for the purposes of work. And we do have, in the, you know, the form of work-based projects, vehicles to enable us to help to bring about that change. And we also need to think about, well, how can the existing resources, structures of the employer be utilized? So one of the very interesting comments from an employer was how they realized the value of what the apprentice was learning to such an extent that they gave them a platform in their monthly team meeting to say, you know, what is it that you've learned from university in the last month that you want to share with the wider team? So that would be, for me, an example of using the structural capital of the employer, the structural capital being the monthly team meeting, in order to enhance the effectiveness, but also the impact of the degree apprenticeship. And I'd like to draw the presentation part to an end there. And back to Paula, and any questions or, you know, comments, observations, questions, please.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. That was lovely. I will actually conclude this now. And we usually stop the recording for our Q&A session. Thank you for mentioning UVAC. Our research center also has affiliation to the University Vocational Award Council. And again, if you are involved in degree apprenticeships, you might already be involved in that organization. If not, Jonathan has steered us to go there as well. Very good annual conferences. I know people have some questions or comments for Jonathan, so I will conclude the recording and we'll launch into that discussion for a little while.